You are in practice session. Attendees cannot join until you start the webinar. Fantastic. Hey.
We're just checking out storage real quick.
Okay, thank you.
Here. This is always such an exciting day. We bring in people, many of whom are alums, and they've gone off to the real world to establish themselves and make their mark.
I am here with career connector Denbal Hay, who is a 2015 graduate from SUNY Oswego, and he is currently working as a senior account executive for ProSec Partners.
Get involved and network with everyone. I mean, some of us don't have internships. If you can't intern, volunteer, reach out. Everyone can always, appreciate some extra help, and that can give you the experience that you need to get that first internship or to get that job that you're looking for.
As successful as it is. And enjoy the summit. Have a great time. Have an Oswego sub on me. No, I'm just kidding. Not on me. Have my sub, but I'm not paying for it. Bye.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Welcome to the 16th annual Dr. Louis B. O'Donnell Media Summit. My name is Ben Grieco.
And I'm Michaela Green. We're seniors here at SUNY Oswego, and we've had the amazing opportunity of being a part of this day event as co-event directors.
Before we begin, we would like to extend our gratitude to everyone involved in today's event. A big welcome to our panelists, moderator, and career connectors who have taken the time to be with us today.
Thank you to the School of Communications, Media, and the Arts faculty and staff members, our folks in the alumni office, the alumni who have joined us today, Professor Brian Moritz, and President Deborah Stanley.
We would also like to give special thanks to the Student e-board who have been able to keep the same legacy that the Media Summit holds, even if it is virtual this year. You have all done an incredible job, and the Media Summit would not be possible without all of you.
There will be time for questions at the end of our discussion. The moderator will let you know when it is time to submit your questions in the Q&A function. You can also ask questions by tweeting with the hashtag OzMediaSummit.
If you are attending for a class and are earning extra credit, a QR code will show up at the end of the Media Summit on the screen that you can scan and fill out the form afterwards.
Lastly, a networking opportunity is available for all students immediately following the panel discussion. You will have the chance to meet with career connectors who are successful alumni over Zoom.
As seniors, we've been fortunate to experience the past 3 Media Summits during our time at SUNY Oswego.
Taking on the role of co-event directors for this prestigious event is something that Ben and I thought we would never do. We originally accepted Professor Moritz's offer in March. SUNY Oswego students were just being sent home for what we originally thought was an extended spring break. Little did we know what the country would go through for the next 7 months and how it would impact the media landscape.
With this year's theme on the front lines with the First Amendment, we watched the world of broadcasting and journalism change as we both prepare to graduate in May.
This was not our original theme choice, but so much happened over the summer after protests broke out over Black Lives Matter, COVID-19 pandemic ensued, and the 2020 presidential election came to the forefront. It would have been naive of us to ignore it.
We felt that it is important to hear directly from the front lines themselves, the media professionals who have covered what 2020 has turned into. Now that we're older, some of these professionals are our friends that have had their lives thrown in a million different directions.
We hope students learn something, whether they are looking into a media-related field or not, and can take something valuable from what will be spoken today. With that, we would like to welcome President Deborah Stanley. We hope you enjoy the 16th annual Dr. Louis B. O'Donnell Media Summit on the front lines with the First Amendment.
Thank you, Michaela and Ben. It's just wonderful to hear from you. Makes me a little nostalgic about a campus without masks and seeing the video with people interacting so much. But these two are just 2 examples of our wonderful students who have been so brave and so active in making the campus still as vibrant as it is during all of these stresses over many, many months. I want to say good afternoon to everyone. Welcome again to the 16th annual Dr. Louis B. O'Donnell Media Summit at SUNY Oswego. Although we really do miss having everyone on our vibrant campus, we are extremely pleased to be able to host our special guests virtually for this unique and exciting event. Our visiting experts have been meeting with students and speaking in classes, helping our students, especially those in the School of Communication, Media, and the Arts, understand the importance of the First Amendment and of the respected and necessary exercise of journalism in our complex society. And now it's time for our main event, the Media Summit that is named for longtime Oswego professor Louis B. O'Donnell, Doc, as he was fondly known to students and faculty. He was a true mentor. He provided students with good advice as they made their way through college and into the creative world of broadcasting. His passion for learning and doing became the passion of his students. The Media Summit at Oswego started in 2005 with the initial support of 1977 Oswego graduate Lubell, who was joined later by Al Roker. And they joined together for a leadership gift that endowed the summit in honor of their shared mentor, Professor O'Donnell. With their generous underwriting, the Media Summit has welcomed leading professionals to campus for the past 16 years to tackle some of the most pressing issues facing the media industries. Today, that continues. 2020 has been a year like no other. And I know for many of us, we don't want it to be a year like any other coming up in the future. From the COVID-19 pandemic to our shared fight to eradicate structural and systemic racism and enact positive change for our communities, to the upcoming election, this has been a year that has demonstrated the importance, the overall importance of a strong, free, and independent press. An incredible group of distinguished professionals join us today, eager to help us sort through this year's theme, On the Front Lines with the First Amendment. Moderating today's discussion is Michael Riecke. Michael's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies here at Oswego and an award-winning broadcast journalist. He also served as the faculty director of the Media Summit for 4 years. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you hosting. The future pros in the audience, to you, we're thrilled to have you here too, as we begin the 16th annual Dr. Louis B. O'Donnell Media Summit. Michael, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, President Stanley. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. All right, it looks like we're back. A little technical difficulty there. Again, thank you, everybody. Welcome. We may have a couple of these hiccups as we try our inaugural attempt at a virtual media summit. So please, participants, those of you in the audience, bear with us. Let's hope things go a little smoother than they have to this point. But I wanted to begin by saying this. It goes without saying probably that this has been a busy year for the journalists on this virtual stage. The work they're doing to hold the powerful accountable, to cast light on the truth, and share the story as it exists today is the American story as it exists today is a vital service to the public good. We've long for the last few months applauded medical professionals, first responders, grocery store cashiers, even teachers, and rightfully so, for risking their health and safety to go to work and provide essential services for the rest of us. Before we begin today, I'd personally like to offer a virtual round of applause to our panelists for the essential work they do and have been doing through the pandemic, for being there to keep us informed and to keep our government in check. Everyone here today, I'm sure, thanks you for your hard work during these really challenging times. Before we begin with our first question, I do want to introduce our panel, make sure we get to know all of them. So let's begin. Steve Brown. Steve, wave your hand so we know who you are. Excellent, Steve. Thank you. Steve is an investigative reporter at WGRZ TV in Buffalo. He has nearly 40 years of experience as a television journalist. He is the recipient of 6 regional Edward R. Murrow Awards and 1 national Edward R. Murrow Award. Before he arrived at WGRZ in Buffalo, he spent 15 years as a correspondent for Fox News. Welcome, Steve. Michelle Garcia is an editor at NBC News, where she oversees NBC BLK, which covers stories, issues, and opinions from the African-American perspective. Michelle holds a GLAAD Media Award for her work covering the advancement of the HIV treatment drug Truvada. Prior to joining NBC, Michelle worked as an editor for Vice, Out, Vox, Mike, and The Advocate. I'd be in trouble if I didn't mention that Michelle is a 2006 graduate of SUNY Oswego's journalism program. Thanks for being here, Michelle. Bret Jaspers. Greetings. Bret is a politics reporter for KERA in Dallas. His stories have aired nationally on BBC, NPR's All Things Considered, and Morning Edition, Weekend Edition, Here and Now, and American Public Media's Marketplace. He's racked up 3 regional Edward R. Murrow Awards and the Kaleidoscope Award, which is given for excellence in covering an issue of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. Bret's career has taken him to markets around the country, including a stop at WSKG in Binghamton, just to our south. Welcome, Bret. Ava Lubell is a legal fellow at the Cornell Law School First Amendment Clinic. Ava provides pro bono legal advice to New York City metro area journalists on a range of First Amendment issues arising from news gathering and from publication. She is a graduate of NYU Law School and Brown University. She's an affiliate member of the New York City Bar Association Communications and Media Law Committee. Hello, Ava. And finally, last but certainly not least, Connie Schultz is here with us today. Connie is a Pulitzer-Prize winning, nationally syndicated columnist for Creators Syndicate and professional in residence at Kent State University's School of Journalism. She won that Pulitzer Prize in 2005 for commentary for columns that judges praised for providing a voice for the underdog and the underprivileged. She is also the author of 3 books. Her most recent, her first novel, The Daughters of Erie-Town, was released in June and is a New York Times bestseller. Thanks for being with us again, Connie. Audience, I'm going to start off with the questions here, but we do want to hear from you today. If you look down at the bottom of your Zoom session, you'll see a little bubble that says Q&A. If you have questions, we ask you to post them there. We will be looking at them throughout the afternoon. So I encourage you, when you have something to say, when you have a question you want to ask, this is your opportunity to do so. You have the best and the brightest in the business in front of you. So please ask your questions when they come to you. In the meantime, let's get started with our first question. And I want to start sort of reflecting on the title of this year's theme, On the Front Lines with the First Amendment. And I want to throw this question out to those of you working in the trenches day in and day out. Given our current climate, how much more important is the First Amendment to you right now? And do you see yourself as, let's say, soldiers of truth, so to speak, people carrying that First Amendment right and using it to the best of your ability, not only to inform, but to serve the public? Who'd like to start? Michelle, I see you smiling, and since you're one of ours, let's begin with you.
How'd you know? No, well, first, thank you for having me today. This is, I love this event. Every time I've watched it. I was there for the first media summit. So I'm getting like, even though we're virtual and everything, I'm getting like great, deep nostalgia feelings. Anyway, so I've been thinking a lot about how the work that I do. So, as you mentioned, my job at NBC is I lead the coverage for NBCnews.com based on, Black identity, Blackness in America, anti-Blackness in America, of course. And I think that a lot of our work, as journalists in general, but, particularly those of us who, cover identity issues, is that we are uncovering a lot of hard truths, especially this year, I guess you could say. I mean, a lot of us, we've been doing this for a long time, and I think a lot of people are now just starting to finally pay attention to it, which is great and not great at the same time. But we'll take it. But the thing I've been thinking a lot about is that the First Amendment is so important, because what we do is uncovering the hard truths about racism and race and racial identity in America. Like, the idea of Blackness in America goes back hundreds of years and has created a caste system that we are still dealing with, and is the basis with which our reporting feeds from. So yeah, like it's like I think about the First Amendment, maybe not like a lot, but we're always primed to think of it as the primary amendment in our Constitution. It's the first one. We think of it as being so important, but it's also consequential. The way that we wield it, the responsibility we as journalists all have to use it. And I'm honestly kind of fascinated, and I think we'll probably get into this a bit, about the range that the First Amendment has, and maybe the guardrails that we might need to think about.
Yeah, we sure will. Connie, I want to come to you next on this question. Do you see yourself as a soldier of truth? What I find really interesting, you may not be able to see it, but before we started, we happened to notice that Connie has a pillow behind her that says First Amendment at the very top. So Connie, is the First Amendment something that's on front of your mind every day when you sit down to write your column, or you tackle your next assignment? Oh, Connie, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
It's been on my mind for the last 4 years, and it's not coincidental that it syncs with the Trump administration. Before he was even elected, he was calling us the enemy of the people. And I'll never forget election day at the journalism school at Kent State. It was triage the day after, with students lining down to meet in my office, many of whom I had not met. It was only my second semester there, and I am a newspaper columnist, and so I am paid to share my opinion. Thank goodness for that. I've been doing it for about 18 years now. And we talk about the First Amendment a lot because the president seems to be so hostile to the concept of journalists holding government officials accountable. And as I think I'm married to U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown, which is only, we've been married for 17 years now, and it's only reinforced in me that the importance of holding them accountable. I certainly think Sherrod's doing fine with that, but he also knows he's going to hear from me on a regular basis about some of his colleagues. And the good news is, after that triage moment, is that the students rallied pretty quickly, most of them, and thought they really had a renewed sense of mission about our profession. I would never attach important titles to myself, as you're suggesting. I will say this, that long before we had Trump, I was concerned that journalists were not being activists for the profession enough. And I understand that when you use the word activist, a lot of journalists will immediately recoil, right? No, we don't get political, but that's not what I have meant by that. I've meant that we have got to make clear to the public why journalism matters and why the First Amendment matters. And if we're going to talk about the First Amendment, the other reason it matters so much to me is the right to peacefully assemble and to protest. And again, we have to look at the administration's approach to this, and too many across the country who feel that people do not have a right to protest for rights. And so this has been an interesting time to be a journalist. I'm really proud of my students, and I'm sure you're seeing it at Oswego too, which, by the way, is the alma mater of our son-in-law, Alex Alejandro Molina. There is a sense of mission that perhaps didn't exist before all this occurred.
Bret and Steve. Bret, I'll start with you. You're both local reporters. Bret, you cover politics in Texas. Steve, an investigative reporter in Buffalo. Bret, I'll post that same question to you. Do you see yourself as a soldier of truth, carrying the First Amendment as your shield, as your armor, so to speak, maybe your weapon?
In one way, yes, but in a large way, I guess I would use a different metaphor. So the one way, yes, is that the First Amendment does like provide legal protection for journalists in a really real way, so that down the road, if there's some problem, I mean, we saw some really unsettling, I didn't experience this, but really unsettling interactions between the press and the police forces in different cities over the summer. So the First Amendment is very legally and practically very important in those situations. But there are a lot of, I was thinking about your metaphor, and there's a lot of different jobs in journalism, and I'm part of a newsroom that's kind of like a daily to weekly newsroom that we're a public radio station that's getting the news of the day on the air, basically. And we do some longer projects when we can. I feel like Steve, as an investigative reporter, might be able to speak about the kind of long-term soldiering if you're uncovering really important things. But what I find myself doing is like a lot of triage and choosing what to amplify, because there's been so many jobs cut from journalism in the last 15, 20 years that, not everybody can be that crusading investigative reporter, which is something that hopefully I'll get time to do eventually, but a lot of us are scrambling right now. So the metaphor I would use is like, some kind of beacon or some kind of light that's telling people this is important. Like this particular thing out of all of the other things that are out there is what we choose to focus on today. And that can be an investigation ideally, but it also can just sometimes be something that a local politician says that, you should pay attention to this part of what he or she says versus this other part. So it's whatever metaphor it involves, like the spotlight, right? I guess that's like a spotlight turner, right? I have a theater background. So that's the kind of metaphor that I think about most in my day-to-day job.
And Steve, how about you? Do you feel like you get the kind of time to do the sort of work that Bret was talking about?
It was less this year, and that's obviously so because it was all hands on deck in New York State for probably the first 7-8 months of this year because of the pandemic. But to carry forward with your question, yeah, pursuit of truth is absolutely what I believe journalists are doing. And I think at times we find ourselves at odds with one facet of the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech. There is so much disinformation that is being perpetuated. And I'm not even pointing necessarily at elected officials, but people have grown comfortable with opinions that match their opinions or ideas that match their worldview. And that may not be reflected in truth. And even if presented information, some people just won't pay attention to it or will dismiss it. So, and I can tell you firsthand that our newsroom actively does stories in our corporation. I work for the Tegna Station Group, which has about 50 some stations around the country. We have a feature called Verify, where we take a look at things that, whether or not they are true and how true they are. And it's become a real essential tool because there is so much bad information or inaccurate information that's out there. And for somebody who, I do view my job as pursuit of truth, pursuit of, if you will, justice, because in investigative reporting, and I know people don't like hearing this, you do come to a conclusion and you do pick a side often. And, it's uncomfortable work for some folks that, are on the receiving end of it. But it's been made more difficult by the pandemic this year. And the pursuit of truth has been made more difficult by people's active use of what is clearly not correct information.
Thanks, Steve. Ava, I do want to come to you on this because you have a really interesting role in all of this, and that is helping journalists like the panelists, the other panelists in this room, sort of sort through any challenges they may confront. What has been trending in your world as of late?
I would say the trends have actually been pretty consistent over the past 4 years. I think it's been really easy to focus on the pandemic as somehow shifting the landscape, but you can look back to Ferguson protests and it's really consistent with what we're seeing now. I tend to look at the First Amendment in 3 contexts. So one is as this beautiful shield, and that's where it most often comes into my work with journalists. Right now, I'm representing journalists in a pro bono capacity as a part of Cornell, but I used to work as a general counsel of different outlets and was in the newsroom, and someone would come at us and threaten us and tell us to take a story down. And I would basically just say, First Amendment, see you later. Beautiful defense. You also get to use it as a wonderful sword. So if someone says, I want access to this government record, or I want access to this court or this meeting, then it's your sword. It's the means by which you can investigate and get information and hold people accountable. But I think we've all kind of alluded to this a little bit. Generally, I think there's a little bit of a darker side to the First Amendment that's being talked about among journalists and also among legal scholars of, what's the point of the First Amendment? If the point of it is to enable conversation and, participation in self-government, that's great. But how does the lack of regulation of platforms and disinformation figure into that purpose for the First Amendment? And similarly, how do we look at the total deregulation of campaign finance and the ways in which the First Amendment has been used to strike down protections for labor? It's a theory called the Lochnerization of the First Amendment, which harkens back to decisions a long time ago that basically used certain laws that were meant to protect people to actually take away a lot of protections. So I tend to look at it in that kind of trifold way.
Thank you. Several of you touched on the disinformation and misinformation that makes its way into our news feeds. And we know many of the students in our audience today, one of the primary ways they get news and information is via social media. And we've seen this election year, we've seen Facebook, make attempts, and Google make attempts to try to bring to a head the amount of misinformation or disinformation that's out there. Twitter blocked political ads. When we have these conversations, are those social media platforms, are they doing enough? And should it be Facebook's responsibility to police speech on the internet? Connie, yes.
I am willing to jump in on this because I've been spending a lot of time on this lately, including in my ethics class. We just watched The Social Dilemma that's playing on Netflix. Highly recommend it to everyone. No matter how much we think we know, it's influencing how we think or how a lot of people think. It really drove home how the algorithms work and how if you look up a couple pieces of information, you like one video, then they send you more. And then you see more stories that affirm what the first story said. And over time, one of my biggest grievances has been how can some people even believe some of this stuff? It's so bad, but it's helped me understand how it happens. Because after a while, it's all they see on social media because of what they search for and what they've been sharing. And that's a real challenge. I do think we in the media made a mistake early on in echoing Trump's allegation of fake news. We started using it a lot, and now it's become such a mantra in the country. And Facebook and Twitter, I do think Twitter's handling it marginally better at the moment. They are flagging what's not true. They will take down sites. They will not take down the president, which I think is actually, as much as it drives me crazy sometimes, is the right thing because it's creating a historical record. And I always want to remind people who complain about us sharing his quotes or his tweets or things he's saying at rallies. Do you really want to live in a country where journalists aren't telling you what the president is saying on a regular basis? So this is an ongoing discussion right now, an ongoing debate, quite frankly. And I'd love to hear what others think here on the panel.
Bret, it looks like you may have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing that you brought up, Connie, because I have had this concern in my own newsroom and with the network sometimes, because this idea, he is a source of misinformation, especially on voting and lots of things. And so playing the incorrect soundbite, which a lot of broadcast news is soundbite driven, right? Television or radio, and playing the incorrect soundbite, even sandwiching it with a fact check, like the repetition of it, I guess studies have shown that repeating bad information creates a neural pathway that says it's true, or that gets cemented in our brains as true rather than the like fact check. So I've really tried to push back on like playing the bad information, and I guess some others might disagree and say that that's not telling the world what the president is saying, but he is, like, especially on voting and things, like actively misinforming people, and we know that he does that. So it's, I don't know. I don't know if the other broadcasters here have opinions on that, because I think it's a real problem. And I don't think just after the fact is good enough of a solution.
Bret, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you think is it better in the because you're right, broadcasters have a particular challenge, and all of you, except I think am I the only print? I think I am. I'm sorry, Michelle. So is it better then? I'm thinking of George Lakoff, right, the linguist, and how he talked about the truth sandwich. But as you said, you're still repeating the lie. Is it better for us not to have the audio of the voice of the person telling the lie and instead introduce it as this was a lie that was told, that the president once again lied about this, or falsely committed, however people want to say it. I have no problem calling it a lie. And this is untrue for this number of reasons. So the focus shifts from being about, play the sound, play the audio, and you get to hear the president's voice. Is it any different? I really don't know for sure. That's why I'm asking you.
I think the paraphrasing it, I would be much more comfortable, because then you are giving people the right information in your paraphrase of it, because you can characterize it appropriately. This is like my own personal opinion. I don't know if my outlet would even agree, but the other option, I suppose, is playing some other cut that's not an outright distortion, and kind of just not putting bad information and not like addressing it, because it's like you're amplifying some untruth. I mean, I'm curious as to what the research says. I don't know, but I don't know. I guess I'm definitely more comfortable with like the reporter or the newscaster or the broadcaster like paraphrasing it in that case to say, he said this incorrect thing, that you should vote twice if you live in North Carolina. That is clear, and not putting the bad information in the president's voice out there, because I think that people, the repeating that has a real effect on what people remember as true, I think, is what the research says.
Bret, and maybe Steve, you can chime in on this too, as broadcast journalists, when you confront an interview subject who you're looking at a particular soundbite, and you know what someone who's not the president, and you know what that person has said is false, what would you do with that clip of sound?
It's simple. I don't use it. You just don't. And I think it's easier. I think in a lot of ways it's easier if you're local, if you're a local journalist. Yes, the president affects my life, but not every day. The county executive and mayor of Buffalo, they affect my life every day. So we spend our time covering them. And if they made a misstatement, we wouldn't run it. As a former creature of a national news organization, and having watched from afar, thankfully, that I wasn't involved in the 2016 campaign or involved in covering national politics, be really truthful about it. I don't think necessarily that everything the president says is news. I think it's important that it be covered, but we don't hand an open microphone to somebody and say, here, have at it on our space. This is our space, not yours. You want to, spout off on Twitter and say what you want. I guess the First Amendment allows you to do so. But I don't think everything that somebody in elected office says is worth focusing on. It can be very harmful what things say, or very beneficial what a public official says. But we have to, I think we have to strain sometimes to not want to stand there with a red pencil and correct things that every elected official says. sometimes it's, in my opinion, it's just not worth the effort.
Michelle, I'm curious in your newsroom how you tackle this issue when the president says something we know to be false. What approach are you taking at NBC BLK?
Well, at BLK in particular, we're we're part of the bigger NBC News ecosystem. So, for us, it's a lot of, I think that we try to be as kind of straightforward as possible. I'm sure some people watching will disagree, but, I think that we try to keep it as straightforward and just simply report what he said. I mean, I just wrote a story. It was my first byline story for NBC, actually, about Jared Kushner, talking about how Black people are complaining about their, the structural racism that they face, and that they don't want to be successful enough, and that's why they're not successful. So, I mean, that's just one example of many things where it's like, well, the story to tell here is very nuanced, I guess. It's, again, like I said before, it is the real story about this is about the hard truths that are, at hand here. They're about, this is not about like, oh, well, not enough Black people pulled themselves up by their bootstraps this year. This is about the structural racism that we, experience in varying degrees, of course. Sorry, you might hear my toddler at the door. Anyway, but, that's what this is really about, is just kind of like, all right, so he said this thing. Now, my story, I actually think was pretty metered because, I talk about like, well, he was talking about his, the Trump campaign's partnership with Ice Cube and the Platinum, I think it's called the Platinum Plan, and their plan for, dealing with certain inequalities that Black communities face and stuff like that. So personally, I thought it was pretty metered, even though, yes, it was calling out the fact that Jared Kushner made this statement, right? Of course, I got a bunch of angry emails telling me that I'm the real racist, naturally. But again, like it's really about like, well, if you read the story, you would see that this is plainly stating what he said in contention with the larger discussion that is actually happening and the facts of the campaign and, what's happening. So, it's, I mean, I really can't speak for the NBC News politics desk or anything like that. They really have their own system, but to me, and I think across the newsroom, this is about hinging on the journalism. And yes, I agree, Steve, like we don't cover absolutely every single thing that that the president says, because what's the point? Like, we're not transcribers, we are journalists, and we are there to present the news. But at the same time, when something newsworthy does happen, we have to present, the facts of the matter. So, it's a hard dance. And I honestly, as Michael recounted everywhere I've worked, I've worked a lot of places during this administration. And every place has struggled with this. And we are 4 years in. It's not an easy decision. It's really difficult. And I think a lot of places are still trying to figure out how to cover this president.
And Michelle, for the record, I mentioned every place you worked because I think it's fascinating how diverse each magazine you've worked for or digitals you've worked for is. It's fantastic. Not everyone gets that chance to serve niche audiences like that so many times in their career. So it's fantastic. Totally.
No, it's not, I'm not like defensive about it at all. I'm actually quite proud of all the places I worked. It's just kind of like, it's kind of crazy. For all you journalism students out there, the media industry is not great. Not always great all the time.
And we will get there during this conversation. I promise. A couple students actually have chimed in with questions about that, and we'll get there before we end our conversation today. Ava, I just want to touch base with you. This question of, do we report everything the president says, and how do we put that into context if it's an untruth? Are you having conversations in your office that deal with this, questions that might arise?
I definitely pay close attention to it, especially in the Twitter context, because just to kind of complicate this narrative a little bit further. So the president, some of you may have noticed, sometimes tweets out unflattering things about people, and there have been individuals who have sued him and claimed defamation. And courts have said, based on the context, we're not going to hold this to be a statement of fact, which is one of the requirements to satisfy defamation. It's based on the way the president speaks on this platform. We know that he's just doing his thing. It's crazy. We're not paying attention to it. That's fascinating that literally the president of the United States puts out, you are this, makes a declarative, what would usually be considered a factual statement. And a court is saying, we're not going to consider that factual. And we saw it not too long ago in the context of the president saying he wanted to authorize the release of the confidential parts of the Mueller report, and BuzzFeed sued on that basis to get access to records. And the Department of Justice went on the record to say, no, that's not a real statement. So even the courts are struggling with how to assess these statements, and are they, a fair and a true report? Are they a government proceeding? How do we wrestle with it? So I think in that context, to the extent I'm helping journalists figure out what they can rely on as a government action, and it just provides more examples for them to think about. No answers, because a lawyer would never give you a straight answer, but more to think about.
Thank you, Ava. I do want to take a question from someone in our audience. This question comes from actually one of our recent alums who works for a local television affiliate as a reporter and anchor. And the question is this, and Steve, this might be a good question for you to start us off. He wants to know, does the broad umbrella term of people in media almost discredit the work done in local communities? And if so, how can journalists work through that stigma, local journalists?
Yes. Do you get, you folks in media always do X or are prone to doing Y? Sure, you get it all the time. The benefit that I have, and I think the advantage that I think that local reporters have, are twofold. Number one, the New York Times might come once every 2 years to Buffalo to do a story, but I'm working it every day. So I'm in their backyard, I'm in their community, I know them. And for younger journalists who are working in a community, and it may not be home, it wasn't home for me for a long time before I was able to hopscotch jobs to get back to it. You have to kind of study, immerse yourself in the community that you're in. If you want to be seen as something other than a journalist, and I think that's important, because I'm a son, a father, a friend, and a lot of other things other than a journalist. It's what I do for a living. It's very important to me, but it's not the only thing that I am. If you want to be seen that way in your community, you need to get plugged into your community so that they can see you, experience you in different contexts other than just the guy with the microphone asking the shoved question to the elected official. I think that's paramount. And the benefit to you doing that is so great, because when people, ultimately this is about credibility and trust. If you have credibility, if they trust what you're saying, they're going to tune in. And if you have those two things, they will turn to you with stories before you ask for them. So to get through that filter of you're a media member, well, you're going to have to do some homework in getting to know your home, getting to, get out and get visible and get active and get a thorough understanding. The number of things that you will learn in that process will be extraordinary. The stories that you will find that you had no idea about, I guarantee you, there's a lot more than you could possibly guess.
Bret, I'm curious how you feel about that. Again, a young reporter out there asking the question, when the media all gets lumped in together and people talk about the big bad evil media, how does that feel on the local level, and how do you work through that?
I think that local journalists are actually more trusted than national journalists. I think that's what the polling or research shows, is that like local television and local newspaper, local radio people actually are pretty trusted in their communities. I mean, I agree with everything that Steve said. I think that the people do have high expectations though for journalists. Like they want them to hold all the powerful people accountable that they want held accountable, and they want an in-depth story on like lots of different things on whatever their thing is, and also the big story of the day. They have high standards, and I'm glad that they do. The disadvantage that you have as a local journalist is there's just not a lot of resources. So the newsrooms are smaller, and they're getting smaller every day. And that's the difference. Like the New York Times is like, you know, way bigger than it used to be. And they're like expanding into audio in a really huge way that might change the industry completely. It's like they have more money than I can imagine having for a news operation. They're a national news operation, but they're even bigger than they were before, and their audience is huge. And at the local level, you just don't have what you need to cover your community in the way it deserves to be covered, even in a big city like Dallas, which is where I live. It's a big city, and we need more people.
You mentioned the New York Times, Bret, so I see a question. We're talking about credibility. I see a question from one of our audience members, and I'll ask it as written. The person asks, newsrooms like the New York Times are continuously coming into question for their liberal use of anonymous sources and botched reporting, as well as their move away from ad revenue to a business model funded by subscribers. How do we reinforce trust in an institution that has led us into wars before and is for the most part beholden to corporate power? So a big ask there by one of our audience members, but let's start with the first part of this question, which is the use of anonymous sources. When is it appropriate? Does it hurt ultimately our credibility when we rely too heavily on unnamed sources in our reporting? Any takers? Connie, go ahead.
Yeah, I talk to my students about this a lot, because especially if the anonymous source has reached out to you, the first thing you have to discern is the motive. Why is this person reaching out to me? What is this person's true access, and what's the agenda going on here? Because you can get really pulled down the rabbit hole on things that have such a personal agenda that you know nothing about. I do think we have to be sparing about it. On the other hand, particularly currently to cover this administration, we have been very dependent on people willing to, in important jobs, willing to talk, but only anonymously, because they're on the inside, and in their view, they're trying to do something to counter some of the policies that are happening. But again, you have to be extremely skeptical. I do push back a little bit on the characterization of the New York Times. It's the biggest, so it will make more mistakes by virtue of being the biggest. And we're the only profession in the world that I can think of that admits our errors and publishes corrections, and sometimes does very long stories about the mistakes we've made. And as far as corporate ownership, I also want to push back on a little bit. I was owned always by somebody else. I mean, the papers I've worked for, and nobody ever has attempted to tell me what to write. I've had big battles sometimes with my editors, particularly before the Pulitzer, but that didn't mean that I was owned by the corporation, or in this case, the family that had owned the paper. And while I understand the opposition, I opposed, for example, the Iraq War in 2003, which is actually how I met my husband, because he was in the House and he was speaking against it. And I'd never covered him. I want to make very clear, do not date somebody you're covering. But the only major newspaper, mainstream newspaper in the country that editorialized against the invasion was the Toledo Blade. Think about that in 2003. So mistakes, newspapers do make mistakes. Editorial boards do make mistakes, but we tend to own them faster than any other profession I know.
I mean,
Ava, go ahead. Yeah.
I would add that, you know, the First Amendment actually explicitly allows for mistake and it's structured in a way to say people are going to make mistakes. And if we say you can't make a mistake, then we might as well all go home, because the standard of perfection is not one that we can attain. And it's not going to allow for the free flow of information, which leads to all these end goals of ours of having an informed citizenry and participation in government. So I think if the goal is no mistake, you're just not going to have any information come out anywhere. I think it's to take accountability and take responsibility for those mistakes, and then to draw the line about what kind of mistake was avoidable or so egregious, or, you know, went so beyond the pale that we do hold people accountable. But I do, you know, I've worked in with a lot of fast moving journalists who are really professional and trying to do their best, and they make mistakes like we all do. On the question of anonymous sourcing, I mean, I always get a little bit sweaty when people want to cite anonymous sources, because there are a lot of really large legal implications to citing them. So, you know, the idea is that you have to use judgment and you consult with various people to make that assessment. But, you know, I always trying to understand the motive of someone, but there's tons of amazing reporting, not just on the national security level, but also if you think about a lot of Me Too. I mean, I think that's a pretty important story, and absent anonymous sources, we probably wouldn't see a lot of that reporting. So do some people have agendas? Yes. I mean, I've had people reach out and pitch stories, and thank God we shut it down once we figured out what the agenda was. But I've also had people who are really scared for their employment, who are really scared of a family situation, and you just case by case. I think that's what journalists are so good at, is deploying judgment in every situation differently and finding the good stories and throwing out the bad. And yes, making mistakes along the way.
I have a little to add, especially as an editor. The term anonymous sources, I feel kind of like the public doesn't quite know what that means. Like, you know, I mean, like it gets thrown around a lot as kind of like, you know, they weren't fully named in the story and therefore they are an anonymous source. And that's, you know, there's so many variations on what that means, you know, like I think that there has been plenty of irresponsible reporting where you don't name the source and, you know, like it's not verified, you know, if you want to call it reporting. But, you know, I would say in most newsrooms that have a strong, you know, journalistic ethic that follow the rules of journalism, you know, we don't rely on anonymous sources for every story, or at least not as many stories as I think people kind of think. You know, there's like off the record, there's on background, there is anonymous, which, you know, we typically don't use. Every newsroom I've worked in has specific guidelines about how to use sources that are not named in the story. We take them very seriously. Sometimes we don't, you know, as Connie was actually saying, like, you know, if we can't discern a clear motive to disseminate information that, you know, is important for the public to know, beyond just kind of like, oh, this person wants to get this story out, then it's not, you know, it's not I can't tell you how many stories I have thrown out that do not follow journalistic, you know, or, you know, from the sources do not follow journalistic integrity, you know? So I think, yeah, the public should always hold the media, us, accountable for the work that we do, and, you know, our sources, like, why are we talking to these people, and you know, is the information that they have to share with us pertinent? Is it important? Is it a public good, or, you know, of public importance? But at the same time, I think, you know, this kind of, I don't want to say obsession, but, you know, like this focus on, you know, anonymous sources, I think can be kind of, I don't know, it feels like we're losing the forest for the trees, you know, like we're not really getting the bigger picture of the stories that these journalists are trying to uncover. So, you know, yeah, sure, anonymous sources can be problematic if they're not treated with the journalistic ethics and guidelines that we adhere to as actual journalists.
Steve, as an investigative reporter, what is your procedure for anonymous sources? Do you use them? Do you use them often? And when you do, what's your protocol?
I try to use them very sparingly, because I think if a reader, a viewer, a listener doesn't know the name of somebody, doesn't see whatever issue, accusation coming out of that person's mouth, I think there's automatically a discount on this, is in the viewer, the reader, the listener's mind. And I think part of it is how effective they are can go a long way towards the person using them. If Bob Woodward uses an anonymous source, then I might feel one way about it. If Steve Brown uses an anonymous source, you might feel differently about it. And I think credibility and use of them it needs to be very sparing when you can. And I've used them particularly in cases where people were filing or would eventually file Child Victim Act lawsuits against priests saying that they were sexually abused. For some of these folks, it's difficult to acknowledge this to anybody, a family member, let alone to a media member. And in one story I did in 2018, I used several anonymous sources about a particular priest who was clearly a pedophile. But the use of these things for the young journalists that are watching this, you should understand this, that if you got a source that says you cannot use my name, you better know everything else about them. You better scrub them. And I tell folks all the time, you're going to get scrubbed. I'm going to look you up on LexisNexis. I'm going to check you out through the court system. I'm going to find out if you've ever had a tax lien. I'm going to have all of it. So you better tell me all of it now, because I'm going to find out about it later. And then you young journalists who want to use an anonymous source, you better be able to pony up all that stuff to your boss, to your editor, and say, this is why I need it. And this is who this person is. And this is how I know. Because you may not tell you may get permission from your editor to not tell the public, but you're definitely going to have to tell them. So that's my guidance, as little as possible. And then you better make sure that these people are square.
I also want to tap into that last question around about the corporate ownership and how that may influence coverage. Connie, you mentioned that no one has ever told you how to write a column or what to put in a column. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think
no, they've complained mightily about it, but they have not told me I couldn't write something about it, right? And I think it's important to emphasize that, because that is the true story of most journalists I know. It's probably, you could talk to people who work for Sinclair stations, however, and you've got a different issue, clearly. But for most of us, there is a difference between editorial, how do I want to say this? Adding the editorial voice to things, giving us editing suggestions and all that, and quite another just trying to kill stories or trying to kill facts of what we're writing. I never, in all my years as a straight reporter, as a feature writer, and then as a columnist, I heard plenty about how the publisher was unhappy with me, to the point where he didn't show up on Pulitzer Day. He was so unhappy with me, but in the newsroom, of course, he went to New York, but nobody ever tried to keep me from writing something. You have to, look, when you're in journalism, none of us got into this to be popular. I wouldn't recommend it as a way to make new friends. Although I've got some wonderful friendships from the newsroom over the years, and I have so many friends who are journalists around the country. We don't get in this to be liked. We get in this to make a difference. We tend to be, I love asking, and I even love my fellow panelists, how many of you were the kids in the doorway, always listening to conversations that you were told were none of your business? I mean, we are natural eavesdroppers. And I tell my students all the time, I do not understand walking around with earbuds in your ears. So many of my columns have come about because I've been listening to a conversation that was a whole lot of none of my business, and it got me going on something, right? The world is so rich. It's different in COVID times. I don't know how it'll be when we go back out, but that's a long answer. I'm sorry to explain that. You have a bunch of renegades. We really are the land of misfit toys in this profession. We are not conformists, and we don't tend to do well when people tell us what to believe, what to write, or what to report.
Thanks, Connie. Moving on a bit, and this sort of fits into another question I had from you, but this one comes from our audience, a member of our audience. The question is this: there has been a troubling trend where reporters have been harassed and threatened with violence. How can we ensure the freedom of the press in the face of these threats, whether it's violence, actual violence against reporters, or simple harassment for that matter?
I personally would like to hear from Ava first, because I imagine you're advising about this.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and I think it's something I've talked about with colleagues at a lot of other really large publications, and I think one of the problems is there's no playbook. There aren't really any laws that provide protection to people. which a lot of, I'm usually was the first call when there was some kind of issue. And a lot of it would be providing some set of emotional support. And I don't mean emotional in a soft way. I mean, like, I can't believe this is happening to you. So a lot of it is about education. So what how to just engage in acts of self-care. I mean, a standard protocol if you know you're writing a story that's likely to trigger certain people, is that we as an organization are aware of that. So what does that mean? Make sure that you're engaging in some set of digital hardening of various tools that you have. So check your Twitter account, check your email, maybe log out of your Twitter account because you're about to see some really horrible things come your way and it's not going to be great for you to see it. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be looked at. It means that you have someone else from the organization who watches it for you, especially if there are threats, which do happen. So, that's a big part of it, is just the soft, how can I be supportive of you? Do you need time off? There's a preparation component to it. As media organizations, we're very reticent to involve law enforcement because once you invite them into your house, they're there. And in general, we're a little bit oppositional to government. So figuring out, hey, I've sent reporters to their local police station just to be like, make sure you know them. Like, you are covering, a dangerous set of people, and there's something about your identity, and it's really important to know that this is very, very much tied to identity safety of journalists. It's invariably minorities and women who, not exclusively, but very much targeted at those segments. But go to your local police station and make sure you know them. And there've been a couple of times where you have to call the FBI, but at the end of the day, there's very, very little you can do. So I think a lot of it comes down to, just general reputation building of the media and people being really conscious of the fact that when you say that journalists are scum, that they're downstream impacts on that. But it's a really distressing issue because there's just not a lot you can do. And, there are some organizations that will occasionally hire security for folks, but that's, it's not financially really sustainable and ultimately doesn't accomplish that much at the end because it's so much of a needle in a haystack. But I think it's a troubling issue.
Thanks, David. Bret, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I haven't luckily had to confront this, and Ava's absolutely right. It's mostly women and people of color that are dealing with this, and so I have that privilege of not having to be that target. I will say to the young journalists in the audience that when you get out into the working world, there is often a lot of attention from your news organization on what you put out on social media because they're really attentive to don't be too opinionated or whatever. And so recently, we were creating some kind of social media policy, and I just kind of said, hey, in addition to policy for us, can we also just put in the policy that the organization will back us up or be aware or be part of the response when we do get blowback from people who don't like a story. I mean, that's kind of inevitable. I mean, I'm definitely thinking one day this will happen. So I just would encourage everybody out there to just, try to find organizations to work for that are going to also support you in that part of your job. Like, you're writing a story on behalf of that organization to cover that community or that beat. Well, in turn, they should not just say, oh, your social media, your negative mentions are that's your thing to deal with. And this came out of the last market I was in, that newspaper, a big newspaper there, that had happened to a reporter, and she was getting a lot of harassment online, and her bosses were just like, oh, okay, like, that's too bad. But, they should at least be aware of it, try to think about how to address it. One solution is, okay, it's fine if you're not tweeting for a day, or somebody else can manage your Twitter account for a day, and we won't get mad at you for not getting the number of clicks that you need or whatever kind of, because, social media is part of your job these days. So your workplace, your boss, your management, like they should have a role to support you because you're writing stories on behalf of your outlet. And if you get blowback, they should be supporting you and like at least involved with how do we deal with this if there is anything to do?
I would like to build a little bit on what Bret was saying and talk about some of the logistics of safety that doesn't involve social media. I mean, certainly, I don't know a woman who shares her opinion for a living who isn't attacked pretty regularly on social media and gets death threats. My first death threats came weeks into my column writing when I said that the Confederate flag should be retired. And we had to get the FBI involved because a gun site listed me as a single mom who's unarmed, which was true, and gave at the time, I wasn't remarried yet, and gave an address that wasn't mine. It turns out there was a Connie Schultz living in Mansfield, Ohio. So we had to let her know and give her an alert. So these things are real. But what I want to talk very briefly about is, what do you do out in public if you're confronted? We're in a battleground state, Ohio. And in 2016, repeatedly, I would stop class. As soon as I asked, how many of you are covering the rally in Cleveland? How many of you are going to be covering the rally? And as soon as I found out there were several, even one, I'd stop and say, let's talk about how we're going to stay safe. And when you are a student journalist, it's really important. It's a great way to meet national media. You go up and introduce yourself soon, because the one thing you don't want to be is alone in a crowd. If the speaker is going to turn that crowd and actually point to members of the media and try to rile them up like a mob, you want to not be alone. Sometimes you are alone. I live in the city of Cleveland. I write nationally, but I've lived here all of my adult life as a journalist. I went to a Cleveland Indians game 2 years ago, right after they said that they're going to take Chief Wahoo off the uniforms. And a journal reached out to me and said, hey, do you mind doing a piece on what this is going to mean for Cleveland? And I thought, sure, we usually go to the home opener because I'm married to a lunatic who thinks the Indians are going to win the World Series one day. So we're at the home opener, and I learned two things. Don't wait until the fourth inning to start doing it, because they've had plenty of time to drink. And be able, before you even start talking to people, know where the security cameras are so you can point to them when they start to get, I mean, the guys were pretty nuts, some of them. They were calling me fake news in my own town where I have worked for more than 30 years. That's when I really started to understand. It doesn't matter if you follow politics. It doesn't matter if you think you don't ever talk about Trump. He's talking about us. And this is what's happening now. So I do think all that self-awareness is important. I would literally point to, I just want to let you know here, sir, there's a security camera right there, and there's another one right there. But keep going, keep talking. One more thing, it's important to have your own tribe. I agree with Bret. It's wonderful when an employer can support you. An editor of one of the largest news organizations in the country told me they've never had so much security assigned to some of their people who write for them. Unfortunately, most journalists will not be working for one of those organizations, right? At least not early in their careers. It really helps to have and this is when you build it now. You start building it now. Who are the people really invested in your success? Who are the ones who can give you wise advice and whom you want to be supportive to? Because I'm telling you, in those moments, it'll really help to have some people who can give you advice and know where to send you to get better advice, like the Avas of the world, who are there to help us and advise us and tell us what our rights are.
Michelle.
Just to add to that, some practical advice is to do a self-audit every once in a while. If you are, tweeting regularly, if you're reporting regularly, if your name is out there regularly, people will find you. And when I was at Vox, I was very fortunate. The company is very proactive in making sure that people are safe. Same thing at NBC. People are, they're very proactive about changing passwords and making sure that our personal information isn't out there and all that stuff. But one thing that we can all do, even if you work at any of these companies, is do a self-audit. Search your name, search anything that people might be searching around to find about you. Go through your social media, see if you have your house tagged in your location. Just these little things that a normal human being would not, a normal harmless person would not have to think about, obviously, but there is hostility against, journalists. So these are little precautions that you can take, that even if you don't work for a news organization or, a company that will proactively, help you stay safe in these in digital situations at the very least. That's, one thing that you can kind of do to sort of maybe a little bit control the outcome.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm seeing I'm trying to take some of these questions and merge them into one. A couple of themes I'm seeing from some folks in our audience involve rebuilding trust in the media and how we get people to start seeing facts as facts again. One person in our audience has asked the question about credentialing. Do journalists need some sort of credentials or license in order to practice what they do? Would that help? I'm going to throw this out to the group. What do you think? What will it take to get people to not only trust the media again, but to actually start believing that a fact is a fact?
As far as credentialing is concerned, I have one. It's the U.S. Constitution. My credential is in the First Amendment. I'm proud to be a member of a group of people whose job is enshrined in the framework for our country. And there have been efforts that I have quite frankly pushed back on, particularly when I lived in Chicago, about trying to get people identified as journalists. And at one point they were asking for fingerprints of journalists that worked in the town. And it's just like, sorry, I ain't going there. I think journalism is something that everybody should, I mean, because we live in an age of citizen journalism, everybody can do it, literally. They may not necessarily do it well, they may not necessarily do it accurately all the time, but everyone can do it. But I push back strongly on any kind of government entanglement with journalists. We have to cover them. I don't want to necessarily depend on them for a piece of identification.
Anyone else want to wait? Michelle, go ahead. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think that any type of like categorization of journalists might be problematic, specifically for the reasons that we are gathered here today to talk about the First Amendment. What I think the bigger problem is like the proliferation of sites and you know, I don't want to call them news organizations, but like organizations, groups that proliferate, you know, misinformation, disinformation, lies, for the sake of content, you know, or rather for the sake of money, you know, because, you know, there are fake news sites that do pretty gangbusters, making all kinds of money because they've been able to game social media the way that a lot of click farms, including one that I used to work with, one fairly legitimate news organization I used to work for, had learned how to do, you know? I think that the proliferation of the laissez-faire way that we treat the First Amendment, I think has also come back to bite us in the butt in a lot of ways, because, you know, there is like this never-ending cycle of who is right and who is wrong about who has the right to proliferate information or to disseminate information, whether it's fake or not. You know, it's one. As Ava was saying, and you know, we have leeway in the First Amendment that accounts for the fact that there will be mistakes in reporting, but when, you know, the flip side of that is, how do we basically dismantle the network of underground media, of, I guess we can call them fake news, of social media accounts that are wholly reckless and, you know, disseminating bad, terrible information. Like that is like the thing that I think is really a war on ideas that I just don't see anybody, myself included, I just do not see solutions for this that are not going to make somebody angry. So yeah, I don't know. I think this is a big question, because it really gets at the root of what we as journalists do, what is considered journalism, and, you know, who can contribute, who can't, how they contribute and how they can't, you know, and what in the sphere of public ideas is valid, you know, to share.
Ava, go ahead.
One thing I would add, I think there's a little bit of a role for third parties, and not quite not quite in the European model, where like they really have strict sets of journalistic guidelines. And in order to get the benefit of certain laws, you kind of really have to map onto those, which is totally alien to us. But a good example of that, notwithstanding the fact that it's been criticized a lot in the last several years, is like the White House Correspondents Association. So they're not a governmental entity, they do some set of advocacy work and link people together across organizations in a way that is beneficial. And I think, as you've seen, the economic kind of just like devastation of journalism, which is the theme of all of this in some ways, is that we don't have the resources to fight back. I think you've started to see on the nonprofit side, organizations stepping in as advocates to kind of replace some of the power that has been lost as resources have dissipated. So nothing formal, but those informal networks, I think, can kind of function that way a little bit.
I promised I'd get to this earlier, talking a little bit about the state of the news industry and where we are right now in terms of, especially during this pandemic. We know, I think the New York Times reported not so long ago that they estimated roughly 36,000 journalists have lost their jobs since the start of the pandemic. Let's hope that job loss is temporary, but we know especially local newsrooms are at risk right now. Why should students especially be concerned about that, and what, if anything, can they do, whether they plan to go into this industry or not? Connie, yeah.
I talk to my students a lot about this, of course. What I am seeing, though, are a lot of, first of all, independent news sources are starting to pop up, news organizations, nonprofits that are helping to fill the gaps. We're seeing that here in Cleveland. We're seeing it in Youngstown. In fact, my husband will let the dogs in and they're about to bark. One second. I am so sorry.
No worries. No worries.
Out, 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 out. Okay. Sorry about that. Oh my gosh. There's a new film out about what happened with the media in Youngstown. I was interviewed in it, and so was my husband. I'm sorry, I can't think of the name right away. It came out of Northwestern. If you Google it, you can find it.
It's coming back. Everyone's coming back in, yeah? Climate is coming back. We had a Zoom issue, folks. We are bringing everybody back into it. So give me 1 second. We can finish this up. Sorry about this.
Maybe as a panelist.
Right.
We almost made it though. I was scared.
All right, you guys are back.
And we're back. Sorry about that, folks.
I thought I had.
And everyone's moved on my screen now too, so I'm not even sure where to look. Connie, you were saying.
I have no idea. I have no idea what I was saying. I don't even remember. I got so panicked and I yelled at my husband because I thought he had gotten on my laptop and interfered with my Zoom.
Young journalists getting into the field, and you were talking about a nonprofit.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Michelle. True journalist that you are listening. So there's that, first of all. Secondly, I tell my students this all the time. You're the future of this profession. and the brain power you're going to bring to this. The history, I mean, you started out on digital. You are so much more. I remember seeing this in our newsroom in the 90s and early 2000s. The younger staff people were trying to tell management, including newspaper owners, the internet's here to stay. We should be monetizing the internet. We should not be giving away our stories for free. The only newspaper that got that right was the Wall Street Journal. Everybody else was first giving it away for free, then trying how to have, I saw a question in the from the students about, well, should we be limiting, does it interfere with journalism to have these paywalls? Journalists have to be paid for what they do. You have to pay a profession to have it work for you. The journalists have a right to support their families, right? To not have to have health care. That's what's all behind the paywall thing. I understand when people complain that it's expensive. I ask that you do that budget talk with yourself and look where, before COVID in particular, where were you spending your money every week? Because it's really not that expensive for most if you give up some things like coffee at the shop and make it at home instead. I mean, I've had this conversation so many times at this point, but there is still a reason to be training for this profession. And I'll add this. I mean, I just came out with my first novel. I don't recommend you wait that long to do it. But the point being that, and my husband, as I said, he's a senator, US Senator. They hire journalism graduates all the time in their communication shop. Campaigns hire journalists to run, including former journalists who move over to campaigns. This is not a one-stop option when it comes to knowing how to write well, knowing how to listen well and to interview. This is a lifelong skill you're learning, and you're going to be far ahead of so many of your classmates and other majors who really don't know how to do this stuff.
Connie, how many subscriptions do you have to news sources? Out of curiosity, do you know?
Yes, because it's part of my tax statement in terms of the deductions, because I
part of your
need them.
job, sure.
Yeah, that's right. So I think I'm at about, around 15 to 20. But part of it is I like to support some of the smaller startups too that I see are doing good work. So I want to support them that way. And quite frankly, I'm not a student anymore. I can afford it. If I couldn't afford it, I wouldn't. But because I can, I absolutely think I should. And I don't require textbooks for my students. So I draw, because I don't want them spending any more money. So I draw on news all the time. And because I have access, they have access.
Well, we probably have time for one more question. About 8 minutes left in our program. I'd like to end on a happier note. Any words of advice, words of wisdom you have for our students as they consider and or pursue careers in media, or simply become media consumers? They are right now. But parting words, helpful words of advice and wisdom for our audience today before we sign off. Bret, let's start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think one thing that I wish I had known, and being in college as a lot of this audience is a good time for this, is to not only kind of look for that job or think about your career as a journalist in whatever like medium you happen to be in, but also like really think hard about like what is an area of interest that excites you, that makes you curious, that you want to dig deep into that particular area, and start developing that expertise now, because I feel like that is really valuable no matter what, like radio to a website to a newspaper to a television station, or an editor, like whatever kind of job you have, like being like an subject matter expert is really valuable and also really fun. And starting now gives you like a lot of time to kind of really get good by the time you're mid-career or whatever. So I would not only get good at the tools, all of the technology. We focus a lot on the, how to cut audio and do put together really good packages and use the technology quickly and well. That's all great, but the subject matter expertise, I think, long term will keep you really marketable, and it's also really fun.
Michelle, let's turn to you next.
Oh man, I just super agree with what Bret said. Like, you do not get into communications, broadcasting, journalism, any of this stuff without being curious and enjoying learning. So there's that. And take advantage of the fact that you're in college and, you know, you could honestly email some hoity-toity, high-level journalism god or goddess and ask them questions, and you know what? They might actually respond to you. Use your time in school to ask questions and play and create and collaborate with your classmates. You know, that was for me, I mean, class was great. Don't get me wrong. I know Fritz Messier is on this call, but my time at Oswego was great because I got to spend it with my colleagues in the journalism department. I got to make, I was the editor-in-chief of the Oswegonian for 2 years. I did improv, which is where I learned how to be a public speaker in a lot of ways. I launched a magazine. I did a lot of things because it's fun, and you know, who cares? It's college, like just enjoy it, you know? So if you can do that kind of stuff, take the time to enjoy the fact that, you know, nobody's watching. Just mess around.
Ava?
I would probably echo that, but in the name of kind of being platform agnostic, I think there's this sense that like you're supposed to read the New York Times and you're supposed to read the Wall Street Journal and listen to NPR, and like if you don't read The Economist, like what's wrong with you? Like I cannot get through The Economist. Like I love journalism and I cannot read it. I'm sorry. I love goofy podcasts. It's how I get a lot of my news. I also like long forms from some weird publications. I think get out of your head the notion like this is how you're supposed to be consuming news, and just consume it in the way that it's going to talk to you. But get everyone else's voice of this is what you're supposed to do out of your head. It's a waste of time and you'll wind up not consuming anything.
And Dava, also students should really, 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 really listen in their media law course, right?
Yes, you should learn it all. It'll obviate the need for me, but yes, you should learn everything.
Thank you. Steve, final thoughts.
Absolutely. You should take a media law class if you aspire to be a journalist. You need to know how the game is regulated. You should take that class. You should pay attention. Absolutely. Don't be afraid to take intelligent risks. It is very easy to do what everybody else is doing and try and stand out in that particular way. Don't do that. Take a risk that you think is smart, that is going to place you closer to wherever it is that you want to go. It hasn't always been successful for me, but it's been successful enough to sustain me for these many years. And I would like to say just a few words about investigative reporting, because it's the reason why I get up and still do this. It is the high wire act in any newsroom. You will likely make a pile of unhappy people. But I will guarantee you that if you tell a story well, fairly, accurately, and powerfully, the world will change. Because I've seen it, because I've done it. And colleagues of mine across the landscape have done this. If you feel the world needs to change, and certainly a lot of people do, my recent college graduate of my 3 sons who just graduated from Binghamton University, he's got loads of ideas and opinions about things and how the world would change. I would say to folks like him, you know, this is the conduit by which change can happen. It's the powerful stories. Journalism has taken down presidencies. It has overthrown governments. It has done all manner of things with just words. If you're looking to make an impact, I would strongly urge you to take a look at that as a form of journalism to take a look at.
And Connie, that brings us to you. Your closing thoughts for our students. You're muted, Connie.
I want you to think big. When I was a student at Kent State, no matter who I was writing for, and soon after graduation, I told myself who I was really writing for was the New York Times. And that was because for me at that moment, that was the goal. And so my standards were high, and I really tried to meet them on a regular basis. I also really, it's true, the more you read, the better you write. Decide what you're interested in and consume it on a regular basis. And finally, everyone's been mentioning people will tell you who they think you are, right? And what you ought to do. I've had, actually, I'll show it to you. It's so old now, on this little piece of paper that a colleague wrote out for me when she interviewed back in 2004, the now late poet, Lucille Clifton. And my colleague said, I think this is going to speak to you. What they call you is one thing. What you answer to is something else. We will always have people who underestimate us. Gnat on your shoulder and flick them off.
I think that is a spectacular way to end this year's Media Summit. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Bret. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Ava. Thank you to the Media Summit Committee for your time today. And of course, our audience for being here. We hope you learned something. We hope you have something to take away from today. And I hope next year we get to see all of you face to face. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you all for attending. Thank you all for your patience. Students, if you need to track your attendance, you can see the link in the QR code that will be up for about another 10 minutes or so. So please let us know what you thought of this year's summit and record your name, and they will get to your professors. A reminder that the Career Connectors, they will be starting probably in another 10 minutes or so. So the links are on our website and they will be at the end of the survey too. So please check those out, say hi to our alumni and learn from them. And thank you all again for attending.
Thanks, guys.